Well, welcome to another episode of the Warriors Walk. I'm Todd, and this is my buddies Keith. And today, I want to share with you something that's a big problem out there, and it's this. We are living in a fatherless culture, not just physically, but spiritually. There's a void out there where young men never hear the words from a loving man, a father figure, that I'm proud of you. And so today we're going to explore that ache and really even a solution, and specifically for those of you in the church, how you can come alongside the younger generation and you can pour into them. Think Psalm 78, 1-7. It's what I wrote out for my kids when I retired from the military, and it's this ideal that we as the older generation have a responsibility to tell the younger generation of the works of the Lord. And so stay tuned for this episode of the Warriors Walk. I said, hey boss, your two guys, like they took rounds, they're dead. And he's like, and I was like, no, like they're dead. He's like, well, I need to talk to him. I was like, no, you don't understand. They're dead. You're welcome. The younger generation doesn't necessarily need more knowledge about God. They need more experience in seeing God at work. I never had that constant companion of a father around. And my encouragement to people that are in the same boat is like, you can still learn from a bad example.
The faithfulness of one generation determines the strength of the next.
Mom, Dad, guess what? I got to pick bikinis with Mr. Carl. And I could see Mr. Carl's face turning red in the evening light there. And he's like, zucchinis. And all those firsts that he did that were dangerous, including deployments, supporting SEALs or Green Berets. And you're like, all right, aim small, miss small, buddy, and keep thinking. We're one generation away from the church not having any leaders if we're not faithful.
Yeah.
If I want to care for the women and children of the church, the best way to do that spiritually and biblically is to care for the men. Right. So Keith, we got a verse here, 2 Timothy 2:2, that I think says a lot. It says, what you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. So how does that land on you?
Yeah. I mean, I think of, so my role for 20 plus years now, serving in youth ministry has kind of personified this, just to really invest in that next generation. And when I think of that, obviously this is, Paul writing to kind of his mentee, Timothy. He was a younger pastor who kind of, rose up to lead a church. And so he's writing him, to do the same thing. So he's like, just as you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust this to faithful men. So he's encouraging him because he modeled this to actually entrust it into other people that he's raising up as well. And so, so when I think about that, like I obviously think about ministry first and foremost, because I've seen that, in my, role as a youth pastor over the years. But, I see that as a father too, so I see I've got 4 boys and I'm trying to entrust them what God has shown me, and it's not easy. It's definitely not easy. But yeah, now when you were in the SEALs, we were talking about this a little bit before we started recording, but you guys had kind of a clear progression. Like obviously, like in the military, there's structure. There's a lot of, everybody knows who's in charge or what the role is, and you have people that are above you and oftentimes below you if you've been in any length of time. And so how did you guys as SEALs organize a team so that you guys were kind of training the younger guys, but also, that you were still learning from the wisdom of older people as well?
Yeah, I guess the easy breakdown is, we called the head shed the top 4, right? You have the OIC, the AOIC, you had your chief, and you had your LPO.
Okay, so those are a lot of abbreviations.
Yeah,
so for the non-military, yeah.
All right, I'll slow down. So officer in charge, and then you had an assistant officer in charge, which really was almost like an admin boy, right? And so he's learned the roles of how to be a future officer in charge of a platoon. Yep. Then you have the chief. He's the sea daddy, right? Like he's the one with the most experience. And so really the O's, the officers, are looking to him for guidance. And then the LPO, the leading petty officer, is hopefully going to become a chief soon. And so he's learning from the chief, but he's also managing the boys. And the boys we call the E5 Mafia. Like they're the ones that really run the show, right? And so they're the ones that get you in trouble, but they're also the ones that get things done. And I was definitely E5 Mafia for plenty of years. And so those guys have departments they're in charge of. And like, I know you're a motorhead. So like, one of the departments was engineering. So outboard motors, anything that runs on a motor, like you own it, right? And so those are your babies. We had one guy, the guys even drew a cartoon where he was holding this outboard motor and just, making out with it. And it's pretty disgusting actually. But But like he was a true motorhead. He loved engines, right? But then he would have an assistant. And so that's the same across all the different departments.
Yeah.
And really, ideally, like as an assistant, you learn, and the next time you're in charge, and then hopefully you can be in your third or fourth platoon, you're the leading petty officer. Fourth or fifth platoon, you're the chief, and then maybe you get a couple bonus platoons out of that, and who knows. But yeah, very clear. I would say to the point where sometimes our org structure could almost be detrimental, but as far as a platoon life goes, it works pretty good.
Yeah, because everybody kind of knows their lane and who they're learning from, who they're
Absolutely. And well, you know who you can't usurp, right? It's like, all right, like if dad says, then like that's what we're doing.
Yeah.
You can grumble all you want.
Now with that assistant role, even if it seemed kind of, petty a little bit when it comes to the role that they have, but that was, I mean, in essence, like a designed role just to shadow someone that you might eventually be in their position, right? I mean,
absolutely. Not only designed to be in their role, but at some point, if you have two squads in a platoon, they're going to be the key guy in that squad, and they're not always together. So even though he's an assistant, he may be the lead. And so he needs to know how to think on his own too.
Yeah.
So that's why a wise assistant, someone who's junior is going to get in the back pocket of someone more experienced and say, teach me.
Yeah, it's good. So many spiritual analogies just from that structure. But I remember you telling one story one time about how you were, I think this is when you were in Kodiak, and there was a group that you noticed that they were depending on too heavily, or a guy in their group that they were dependent on too heavily, and so you just took him out right away and then send them on their way. So can you tell that story again, just as a refresher, because you don't want to rely too much on one person,
Right. Yeah, we had something it was a 30-day block of instruction, covered a lot of topics, but at the end we had like a final training exercise that put everything together. And I would look for platoons that relied too heavily on one person, regardless of the rank. It could be a junior person, senior person. In this platoon, it was two junior guys. Like they were some of the youngest guys, but they were also really good. Yeah. And so I was like, all right, I know what I'm going to do. So as we're getting ready to insert on this beach and they're going to swim ashore and start their FTX, that final training exercise, I just tell the two guys like, hey, you guys are dead. You can't talk. Just stay here in the boat. And they're like, okay. And they were like, they didn't break their heart because it was like, sleeting sideways and 10 degrees. And for the next 4 or 5 days, they're going to freeze to death. And so everybody slips into the water. And then I grabbed the OIC, who actually wasn't very good. And he was, and it showed. I said, hey, boss, your two guys, like they took rounds, they're dead. And he's like, and I was like, no, like they're dead. He's like, well, I need to talk to them. I was like, no, you don't understand. They're dead. You're welcome to grab their gear. Yeah. And so he scrambled and they grabbed their backpacks, their rucks, and off they went, and they did horrible. Yeah. Because they were relying on these two guys. And there's a big lesson there too, in that specifically for military, you don't know who might get injured or die on an op. And so everybody needs to have, an awareness of what to do. Specifically, the thing I like to ping on is land navigation, right? Or boat navigation, all those things. If platoons are honest, a lot of times they rely on their ringer. Like they have a country boy usually that he doesn't need a compass or a map. Like he just knows where he's at. And so, and it is easy to rely on those guys, just like it's easy to rely on GPS instead of do a good map study. Yeah. But it also shows, like, the question you ask a platoon is, whose responsibility is it to navigate? And the right answer is everybody.
Yeah. Well, and I like that missional approach where you're trying to teach the other guys to one, like, be replaceable because you're investing in other people, but also to not depend solely on somebody else for your own survival, and so there's a kind of a healthy balance there. I think even spiritually where, as older people, as older men, in the church are living their lives, maybe they think that they don't really have anything to offer, like to other younger generations. Like maybe they feel like, oh, I'm going to be around forever, so I'll be able to do it for them. And realistically, like you almost have to work yourself out of a job. Like you have to replace yourself spiritually, so to speak, by investing, what you've learned into younger men. And I think there's a hesitation maybe from older guys that even maybe have a desire to invest in the younger generation, but they feel like, one, they don't have anything to offer, or two, that the younger generation doesn't want any mentors. And I think there was a season, and this is why, you chase trends of churches and stuff. Like even within our church, McLean Bible here, we had a young adult church for a long time where it was literally just a whole church basically functioning within our church. It was called Frontline, that was just young adult. We had their own staff, their own teacher, pastor, their own services, like our mission teams, their own small groups. Like it was basically everything that you would do in a normal church, like functioning with just young adults. And they did tons of demographic research and stuff. And when that was started, that was like they didn't really want the older generation like investing in them. And then as it progressed, they were like, we need older people to invest in us. And so they ended up kind of folded it into the larger part of the church. And we just knew that even like the feedback from this younger generation, like they want to have other people that invest in them. They want to see multi-generational mentorship. And so just kind of pop that balloon of expectation that like no one really wants it. That if you approach someone like they, if they're wise, they will, if they would want to learn from someone older than them. And so we're talking on this episode about mentoring and leading the next generation of men specifically. Why do you think that's crucial? Why do you think it's a crucial thing to just focus on men? Because you've talked about this recently, like in our church and just how, even as we spend time working on this content and everything, like what is it? I think it's like 96% of our audience is men.
Yeah.
And so why is it important to invest in men specifically?
For me, my opinion would be, if I want to care for the women and children of the church, the best way to do that spiritually and biblically is to care for the men, right? So for me, if I want to care for your bride and your 4 boys, it's like, how do I care for Keith? How do I pray for you? And I think the other thing is, by investing in the men and, God's calling them to lead their homes, you are training up the next generation. And I've told you this before, and you've experienced it here too. There seems to be a tension point where older people feel awkward to go to a younger person saying, hey, I'd like to disciple you, because they don't feel qualified or it feels weird. But young people feel the same way. They feel really awkward to go to an older person saying, hey, would you disciple me? And so that's where we have to encourage people to kind of meet in the middle. And so we have different programs where we try to broker that. But it's just so important. And even like, going back to the Navy analogy, like if you're not being mentored and discipled, like you're not being anchored. And we all need to be anchored, right? Otherwise, we'll be adrift and we're not going to accomplish what we want. And so it's so important to have that firm foundation, especially in this confusing culture that we're going through. Yeah. So I think pouring into men is a big deal.
Yeah. Well, and I even go back to, it's hard to, escape that analogy of, wartime living and, being on like a war mission, like spiritual war is real. Spiritual battles are real. And just to think of, like, if you're, if you and your guys that were all your same age, like all your graduating buds class, they just said, hey, we'll just be the last ones. And you just didn't invest in any more, people. And it's like, well, then we would be in trouble as a nation. Like if we didn't have a military that are investing in younger people. And so when we have that spiritually, we don't see that as a big deal. But it's like, well, listen, like we're in a spiritual war. Like, and if we're not training up the next generation of young men to lead their families well and to lead themselves well, like we're not really doing them any justice by just having unprotected borders, so to speak. So with that, let's look at Jesus's model for discipleship. So when you look at the Gospels and just 4 accounts of Jesus's ministry, his public ministry, what do you see? Like, what do you observe in Jesus's style of discipleship?
Yeah, well, one, he tells us to make disciples, right? That's kind of the commission that he gives in Matthew 28 there.
Which he was talking to his disciples, so he's basically saying, replicate yourselves, make more of yourselves.
Get out there and do it, boys.
Yep.
But it is that hands-on training, and again, it just goes back to, I think, what I observed in my military career. I am not very good at abstract learning, so like you could tell me some way to work on an outboard motor, but for me to learn it best, I need to get the wrench in my hand and actually start doing what you told me.
Yeah.
And then I kind of anchor it. And so hands-on training, Jesus gave them real-world experience, saying, all right, now go out and do what I just modeled for you.
Yep.
So they go out there and do it. And then I think it is like, you do see how he bust out, even though he had the 12, he also had the 3, right? So he had 3. And again, it was, Peter, James, and John, and he really poured into them on another level and let them even see some things like the transfiguration and some other stuff, right? So I think that was significant. And then again, it was this ideal of multiplication. And we're here today because they were faithful to that call. And I don't know the original quote, who it belongs to, but I remember hearing something like, if we're one generation away from the church not having any leaders
Yeah.
if we're not faithful.
Yeah. Well, that Judges 2:10, it's like where the whole generation after them didn't know the
Didn't
Lord
know
or
the
what
Lord.
he'd done for them. And so,
Yeah.
that's scary.
It's really scary. But you see it, right? I mean, you even see it in culture. People, I ask questions all the time, like, what's a republic? Or, just some different questions about, America, and you just get stares.
Yeah. So, we see, Jesus is modeling, he didn't just talk to everybody. Like, he had a close-knit group of people that he chose, 12 disciples. And then even within that, that extra time, with the three, Peter, James, and John. And then, but then that idea of equipping them to multiply at the end, I thought like that was such an interesting dynamic when you see like God's grand plan was to basically just trust people to do it, like, to spread the gospel, to, make disciples. And then I think like the ultimate act of trust is literally to leave, like to walk away and say, you got this. We're going to give you the resources. Like, we have the Holy Spirit, but he's like, hey, I'm going to go back to heaven. Like, I'll come back one day, but make disciples while I'm gone. And that's like a weighty, trust from the Lord, where he's like, no, like the plan now is for you to carry this. So
have you ever done that with your boys? Have you ever given them a task and leave?
Yeah, well, that's what. Yeah, because like when we stick around and we make sure that they do it, then they're still dependent on us, to tell them what to do. And so so even with that, like we try to teach them heart qualities, like like responsibility, where it's like they can observe everything that needs to be done instead of just telling them everything that needs to be done. And so it's like the dishes are piled up on the counter. It's like, so what needs to be happening here? And they're looking around. They're like, I need to go put my clothes in the hamper. It's like, nope, try again. And you just wait for them to get it. But so I think leaving them to do the job, that's an act of trust.
For sure.
To get it done.
And it makes me think of my son being in pararescue for 13 years or so now.
Mm-hmm.
And as a PJ, I did my best to prep him, and teach him, with my medical background as an 18 Delta guy too. And I was just trying to pour into him, but there's only so much you can do. And then like,
it's like
go get him, Tiger. I'm not with him on his first jump or whatever. And you're like, oh man, like pay attention.
Yeah.
And all those firsts that he did that were dangerous, including deployments, supporting SEALs or Green Berets. And you're like, all right, aim small, miss small, buddy, and like, keep thinking. But there's something beautiful about it too, where we have a better bond now, or I would say it's just increased in understanding, where he knows more about what I did in his role, and I can appreciate what he's doing. And so it's kind of a cool bond we have.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, speaking of that kind of generational bond that you guys have, so going back to even Timothy and Paul. So Paul, he even called Timothy his true child in the faith. 1 Timothy 1:2. He mentored Timothy. He passed down doctrine. He prepared him for leadership. But then he went on to the next missionary journey. Like, he left him in charge, similar to what Jesus did for his disciples. But in Timothy, in turn, he was commanded to disciple faithful men. That passage that we started off with, 2 Timothy 2:2. Disciple faithful men who would keep the chain going. And we don't want to be that link in the chain that's gone, right? Like, we want to continue to pass down the baton of faith to the next generation. And so, there's so many ways we can do that. But what are some practical steps before we get into our survival tip a little bit? But what are some practical steps that we can, if someone wants to, they see it, they're like, they don't need to be convinced that it's important. How can an older man that's watching this or listening to this invest in a younger man, and vice versa? Like, how can a younger man find a mentor to start discipling?
Yeah. I think this might be easier to explain for me, if I just tell a quick story, in that, because I experienced this personally. If my dad's listening, I love you, but like, my dad left and there was a void there. I never had that constant companion of a father around. And my encouragement to people that are in the same boat is like, you can still learn from a bad example. And again, I'm sure he did the best he could, but like, it wasn't the best example of fatherhood. But I had two grandfathers that recognized that void, and they stepped in. They both loved God. One was a rancher and a fish and game officer, and the other one was a pastor, but he was bivocational, so he worked stockyards. And so they knew how to keep a young man out of trouble and teach him. And so I was up at 3 a.m. doing trap routes and all the other chores, and in bed real early because I was exhausted, and it was rinse and repeat. But there was some value in that. And even though they weren't real cuddly or lovey-dovey, they spent time with me and they taught me things. And so that's, I would say, as far as a blueprint goes, it's the key ingredient is spending time with that next person, that next generation, right?
Yep.
So even identifying somebody and get past the whole phrase that you and I know, awkward is awesome. Like just initiate the conversation, be the
Yep.
grown up,
Yep.
and step toward it, right? And so I
Yeah.
think that's important. And then, I'll give one example of how I discipled younger men when I was in the teams because I was really busy. And so sometimes I could only meet them at 4 a.m. And they're like, 4 a.m.? I'm like, if you want me to pour into you, I'll meet you here at 4 a.m. And they're like, okay. And so even that, or I think of, one of our other pastors, seminary professor that discipled him, he's like, well, the only time I have is when I go running. So if you want to be discipled by me, you're going to run with me.
Yeah.
And so that's what he did because he wanted to be discipled by him. So it works both ways. And if anything, if you're the one seeking out a mentor, someone to disciple you, you should take any opportunity they give you, and you need to be willing to meet them at whatever time they give you, right? Because you're the one that actually has a need. They're not asking you to disciple them.
Yeah.
So I think it's that flexibility I think is key. And then this is painful, but you and I know this as fathers, right, is leading by example.
Yeah.
Because boy, do our kids watch us. Our grandkids watch us.
Yeah.
I shared a couple weeks ago in a sermon, a video of my granddaughter mocking me going down the slide.
Yeah.
I mean, she just turned 2 and she's already observing. Like she knew how to grunt and groan going underneath the bar to get on the slide. And then she even turned her head a certain way so the left ear was focused towards us because that's the ear I can hear out of. And I was like, and she's 2.
Yeah.
And so I'm very aware that they're watching us. And even in our dialogue, I love the questions that grandkids ask.
Yeah.
And it's like it's revisiting parenthood, but just on a whole nother level of fun.
Yep.
And then I guess the last one is don't be afraid. And you and I know this from youth ministry. I think sometimes we don't expect much from younger people. And I think they do need to be encouraged, but they also need challenges. And I don't remember who said it, but I know you and I resonate well with it. And I believe maybe it was Greg Steer, our buddy. But it's this ideal like the younger generation doesn't necessarily need more knowledge about God. They need more experiences seeing God at work. And that's what we've seen when we go share Christ with teenagers, younger people, when they see. Like I remember that one little boy who was shoveling the sidewalks down in Woodbridge, for the Derek Share conference, right? And he had this opportunity to lead an older woman to the Lord. Like it wasn't because he was, some scholar.
Yeah.
He just shared God's word and like God did a great work in her heart and she got saved. Yeah. So I think those are the things that are so important for youth and we shouldn't shy away from them.
It's huge. Well, and I've also found, if you're an older guy trying to invest in a younger guy, look for someone who has maybe low skill but high will. So like there's kind of the 4 quadrants. You have like low will, low skill. Usually they don't care and they don't know they don't know how to grow and they also don't care.
I call it wet wood.
Wet wood. And then you have like high skill, low will. So those can be people that have been raised in church and they have a lot of scriptural knowledge, or maybe they're even a little pharisaical, like where they just don't have a desire though to even grow. Like they're kind of arrogant or. And then you have a lot of new believers fall in this category. You have that low skill, high will. And so they're like very motivated. They just need to be pointed in the right direction. They just need to be resourced. And that quadrant there is one of the best to invest in because they're hungry to learn. They'll show up at 4 a.m. They'll go on a run with you because they see the value in learning.
They'll give you plenty to do.
Exactly. And then you want to get them into the last quadrant, which is high will, high skill, where they're like, they know what to do and they're very motivated to do it because they love other people. They love the Lord. That
reminds me of a guy that came to know the Lord when I was a BUDS instructor, a fellow instructor with me, and definitely raw and low skill, high will. I just called him my young Timothy, and he wore me out. Like he would just consume anything I told him to read, but then he would also like he didn't know enough to facilitate conversations with other instructors, so he'd get them all spooled up, and then next thing you know, 20 guys are piling into my office, all fired up about some topic he started. I'm like, okay, this is a lot of work.
Yeah,
but it was good work.
Yep. Well, that's what we're really focusing on in this episode is that we don't really need more spectators. We don't need people on the sidelines. We need spiritual fathers. Even if you don't have any sons or daughters of yourself, invest in other people that are younger within the local church. Let the legacy of your faith not just stay with you, but invest that in other people. And yeah, I'm sure someone has invested in you if you're listening to this in the past. And so you kind of already have an idea of what that looks like, and just do that for other people.
Yeah.
And so you have a survival tip based
I,
on the chain of command.
I do, but before I share it, like you just made me think of a story I shared from the pulpit a few weeks ago. So sometimes there's also a risk raising up the next generation. And when we lived in San Diego, we had a lot of dear saints that poured into our kids. They were like surrogate grandparents. And so we sent our son home. He was 5 years old, I believe, with Mr. Carl. And I know you know the story, but like I sent him home. Nancy and I did, my wife. And this is where, we had an evening church service. So we came back and he got out of the car and he was running towards us and he was screaming at the top of his lungs, Mom, Dad, guess what? I got to pick bikinis with Mr. Carl. Well, yeah, I said bikinis.
Yeah.
And I was like, and I could see Mr. Carl's face turning red in the evening light there. And he's like, zucchinis.
Just
I was
to
like,
clarify,
I was like,
zucchini,
did we just make the biggest mistake of our lives by sending our son home with Mr. Carl, the
Yeah.
bikini addict?
Yeah.
It was like, thankfully it was zucchinis, right?
Just helping him in his garden. Yeah.
But even that just illustrates, though, like there's so much beauty from the older generation pouring into the younger generation, even if they're not blood, right?
Yeah.
There's the spiritual fathers, the spiritual legacy. And so,
Yeah.
so important. And then as far as the survival tip, again, not a hardcore one as far as the outdoor goes, but it is wise in that, like, you think military, we all know painfully the chain of command, right? And it is important. But I guess the ideal is that leadership is also supposed to be vulnerable. And when I think of that, like I love what's been modeled for me. I had a season where I worked with the Marines waiting to go to Buds for the SEAL training. And I remember watching the older Marines, the more senior Marines, make sure that I think the Marines do this best. They always have the junior people eat first, and you go by rank backwards. Now I've seen other units where rank cuts in line, and it just drives me nuts because I don't understand how you could cut in front of the junior people you're leading. And so I've carried that over into how I think as a pastor, and that, like, when we have the potlucks,
Yeah.
I am not eating before the people. Like, if I'm coming to a potluck to be fed, then I'm wrong. Like, oftentimes, because you and I spend a lot of time visiting with people, because that's when they have an opportunity to bend our ear, I'll make sure I eat before I go to a potluck, because I realize food's probably not going to happen.
Yeah.
And that's okay. Like, that's not my job, is to show up as the pastor of a church and eat while everyone else has a burden or a care,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I think that's something, and I think men need to observe that in older men, that you're vulnerable, that you care. And everybody has their different levels depending on their age and demographic and all that, on, what vulnerability means. But I guess a better word for me is even just being transparent in that, even like in parenting, right? Like, one of the best things I think your boys could experience is you, when it's age appropriate, sharing the things that you struggle with, so that they realize, like, oh, I thought I was the only one, because every boy thinks that at some point. And so I think when we as men are transparent, and even like, when I gather military groups, law enforcement, firemen, EMS workers, when we meet Thursday evenings, like I've shared before on here, there's something beautiful when someone will share something and everyone's like, whoa, you too?
Yeah.
And then you have a friend for life,
Yep.
but we know how the adversary treats us, and he wants to isolate us and make us think we're the only one. So when we practice a healthy chain of command, and we have somebody to care for us, and then we can model, man, we're going to be blessed. And of course, we put down here Moses pouring into Joshua, right? And like, God was like, because you smacked that rock, and I was like, I tell you what, like a million times over, I would have not entered the promised land, if I was Moses. So, but because he did that one thing, God showed the seriousness of that by not letting him go into the promised land. But in the meantime, he was raising up Joshua, right? And so Joshua and Caleb, the two spies that came back, and like, we can take them,
Yeah.
And so God picked Joshua to lead. And I love even how when Joshua, chapter 24 finishes, wrapped up, is like, choose you this day whom you're going to serve. But for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord. And that's the plaque we have on our wall when you enter our front door. But it was telling, and then it was neat to see that all the people that followed Joshua leader-wise, they also led well. So you see generations for a season lead, but then we get into the sobering part of Judges we were talking about earlier, right? Where then, because people weren't faithful, then there came a time where nobody even knew who God was.
Yeah. Well, and that's where, I love this quote that we put in the notes here: the faithfulness of one generation determines the strength of the next.
Mm.
And yeah, I mean, that was demonstrated in Moses and Joshua, and then yeah, somewhere along the line, it didn't carry on, with Israel, and yeah, we could see that time and time again.
Yeah. We
Yeah,
got work to do, don't we?
definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Keith and I, we love doing this and we love pouring in to you as listeners, but we would love for you to do us a favor. If this content is meaningful to you, would you like it? Would you share it? Because when you do that, I'm learning a lot from Keith. He knows a lot more about podcasts than I do. But what we're learning is that when you guys share this information, it allows us to reach more people. And the ideal is to promote who Jesus Christ is. Like, we want to equip fellow soldiers. That's why it's called the Warrior's Walk. We want you to get out on the battlefield. And like Keith mentioned earlier, the Warrior's Walk is designed to equip you for the battlefield. We do not see the church as a cruise ship where the church staff is fetching drinks and making you happy, but it's a battleship and we're trying to equip you for war. And so if you don't have one of these mentors in your life, really make the next effort. Challenge your pastor, challenge your leadership in your church and say, hey, I would like someone to disciple me. But in the meantime, we really would appreciate your support because it matters, and it matters for eternity because we want to equip you guys so that you can get out there and you can tell people how important Jesus is in your own life. So until next time.